Hello and welcome to the AI Localization Think Tank series, AI Research Explained. In this series, we break down important AI research into simple terms and discuss what it means for our industry.
Today's episode is about a paper that tackles one of the most uncomfortable questions in AI. How should a machine decide when every decision causes harm? The paper is called The Moral Machine Experiment, and it was published by researchers from MIT and their collaborators in the journal Nature in 2018. It describes the largest global experiment ever conducted on human moral preferences in the age of autonomous machines.
Before we dive in, let me add a quick note. The examples in this episode relate to traffic accidents and life and death situations. If you or somebody close to you have been involved in a car accident recently, you might want to skip this episode. So please continue only if you feel comfortable doing so. With that said, let's get into it.
Imagine an autonomous car driving down the street. Suddenly, the brakes fail. The car can't stop, and it has only two possible outcomes. If it stays on course, it hits one group of people. If it swerves, it hits another. And there is no option where everyone survives. When human drivers face such dilemmas, they react in a split second. They have no time to think but act based on instinct. However, a machine cannot rely on instinct. It has only code, which means that someone must decide in advance how the car should behave in such scenarios. And that leads to a deeper question. Whose moral values should that code represent?
To understand the problem the researchers were trying to study, we need to start with a famous thought experiment in philosophy. It's called the trolley problem.
Imagine a runaway train racing down a track. Ahead of it are five workers who cannot move out of the way in time. On a side track, there is a single person who cannot move out of the way either. An observer is standing next to a switch that can divert the train onto the track where the single person is standing. If the observer does nothing, five people will die. If the observer pulls the switch, the train will be diverted to the side track and only one person will die instead. What should the observer do?
This dilemma contrasts two classic ethical frameworks. The first one is utilitarian ethics. It postulates that the morally right action is the one that produces the greatest overall good. In this case, sacrificing one life to save five maximizes the overall good because a larger number of people are saved at the end of the day. The second framework is called deontological ethics. Here, the focus falls on moral rules and duties. So, from this perspective, moral rules must be obeyed even if the outcomes are worse. So, it is considered morally wrong to intentionally cause the death of somebody, even if the end goal is to save many more lives.
For decades, philosophers debated these dilemmas mostly as abstract thought experiments. But now, with autonomous vehicles and AI systems making real world decisions, questions like this are no longer just philosophical puzzles. They have become engineering problems. And that means that someone has to decide in advance what kind of moral logic gets written into the machine code. Who decides? Engineers, policymakers, companies, regulators, society? And how do we find out what people actually want machines to do? This is exactly what the moral machine experiment set out to explore. To measure the public moral preferences at scale, the researchers built an online platform called the Moral Machine. It was essentially a multilingual interactive game, and it is still up and running, and you can access it at moralmachine.net. Participants in the game were shown two unavoidable crash scenarios involving a self-driving car, and they had to decide which outcome they considered, let's say, less bad. For example, should the car here stay on course and sacrifice the lives of three passengers, or should it swerve and sacrifice one cat's life? Or should the car stay on course and hit three jaywalking pedestrians, or swerve and sacrifice a single passenger? Or should the car save a group of adults or a smaller group of children? And the scenarios were not random at all. The experiment systematically varied 9 moral dimensions. Specifically, participants were asked whether to spare humans over pets, more lives over fewer lives, young people over the elderly, passengers over pedestrians, women over men, fit individuals over those that weren't in such a good shape, people with high social status over those with lower one, and lawful pedestrians over jaywalkers. Additionally, participants had to choose whether the car should stay on course or swerve, that is, whether they prefer action over inaction. And the scenarios also included characters like doctors, executives, homeless people, athletes, children, and elderly people to see how those identities affected the choices made. In total, the experiment explored 9 different ethical factors influencing decisions.
The response was enormous. Over 2.3 million people participated. They represented 233 different countries and territories, and they contributed with nearly 40 million moral decisions in 10 languages. So that global scale made it possible to extract global patterns in humanity's moral reasoning.
And despite cultural differences, the data revealed a few universal moral preferences that appeared consistently across the world. 3 stood out very clearly. First and foremost, we prioritize our own species across the board. Overwhelmingly, people chose to save humans over animals. This was one of the strongest global preferences observed in the dataset, and it gives us a pretty clear starting point for any kind of ethical framework. Second, we tend to think in terms of numbers. People strongly favored saving a greater number of lives over fewer lives. And this aligns with the classic utilitarian principle to maximize the overall well being. Finally, we have this powerful instinct to protect the young. The data clearly show that people consistently chose to spare children and young adults over the elderly. In fact, the characters most likely to be spared were babies, children, and pregnant women.
These three preferences, saving humans over animals, saving more lives over fewer lives, and sparing the young over the elderly, emerged as possible building blocks for machine ethics. However, while some preferences were nearly universal, others varied significantly across cultures and regions.
When the researchers analyzed the responses by country, they discovered 3 major clusters of moral preferences. The Western cluster. This group included North America and many European countries. These societies showed strong preferences for saving more lives and prioritizing younger individuals. Then we have the Eastern cluster. Countries in the east and part of South Asia showed weaker preferences for sacrificing the elderly. The respect for older members of these societies appeared to influence their decisions. And then we have the Southern Cluster, which includes France and many Latin American countries. Participants from these countries showed stronger tendencies to spare women, stronger tendencies to also spare physically fit individuals, and they had much weaker preferences for saving humans over animals. These patterns suggest that moral judgments are influenced by deep cultural values, not just individual opinions. The researchers found that variations in moral preferences correlate with broader social factors. For example, individualistic societies which emphasize personal autonomy showed much stronger preferences for saving the greater number of lives, while collectivist cultures which often emphasize respect for elders, they showed weaker preferences for sacrificing older individuals. Economic and institutional factors mattered as well. Participants from countries with strong rule of law institutions were less tolerant of pedestrians who violated the traffic rules, such as jaywalking. In other words, people's culture, religion, traditions, and social environment shape how they believe AI systems should behave.
These findings raise an important challenge. If moral preferences differ across cultures and regions, then what ethical standards should global technologies follow? The moral machine experiment shows that ethical expectations are not fully universal. They're shaped by culture, religion, traditions, various social norms, and institutions. So, if an AI system is deployed globally, then the question is what ethical design should it have, and will that ethical design feel legitimate everywhere? And for localization people, this question sounds very, very familiar. We often talk about adapting tone, language, imagery, user experience to the local markets. But what happens when AI systems don't just translate content or generate content, but actually act based on the moral values embedded in their design? How do we ensure that we can adapt AI systems to the local cultural and ethical norms? The moral machine experiment does not give us the answers to those questions. It only shows us how hard the problem really is. If AI systems cross borders, should their moral logic be localized? This is not just a question for self driving car manufacturers. It's a question for anyone who is building AI systems for the global world.